Kalorama, a recorded books Highbridge imprint, presents How Hitchens Can Save the Left. Rediscovering Fearless Liberalism in an Age of Counter-Enlightenment. By Matt Johnson. Read by Mike Chamberlain. Introduction. First Principles. In the introduction to his 1993 collection of essays, For the Sake of Argument, Christopher Hitchens affirmed his commitment to the left. Everyone has to descend or degenerate from some species of tradition, he wrote, and this is mine. Hitchens's political trajectory is often presented as a story of left-wing degeneration. His career was something unique in natural history, as former Labour MP George Galloway put it. The first-ever metamorphosis from a butterfly back into a slug. After Hitchens abandoned socialism and all other formal political allegiances, his critics say he became a fulminating reactionary, a neocon warmonger, and a dreary cliché, the defector, the sellout, the predictable left-wing apostate. The standard left-wing narrative about Hitchens is that he exchanged his socialism for some species of neoconservatism. After many years as a left-wing dissident in Washington, D.C., he took the side of the U.S. government when it launched the most maligned war since Vietnam. Sure, he said a few sensible things about the excesses and contradictions of capitalism in his days as a Marxist, established himself as the most lacerating critic of U.S. foreign policy in the American media, and did more to put an asterisk next to Henry Kissinger's reputation than just about any other writer. But this long, radical resume is now just a footnote in what many on the left view as a chronicle of moral and political derangement, the once great left-wing polemicist becoming an apologist for the American empire. On this view, if the left has anything to learn from Hitchens, it's strictly cautionary. From Socialist to Neocon. It was an irresistible headline, because it's a story that has been told over and over again. According to many authorities on the left, butterflies have been morphing back into slugs since the dawn of natural history. The novelist Julian Barnes called this phenomenon the ritual shuffle to the right. Richard Seymour, who wrote a book-length attack on Hitchens, says his subject belongs to a recognizable type, a left-wing defector with a soft spot for empire. Irving Kristol's famous description of a neoconservative is a liberal who has been mugged by reality, which implies a reluctant and grudging transition from idealism to safe and boring pragmatism. By presenting Hitchens as a tedious archetype, hobbling away from radicalism and toward some inevitable reactionary terminus, his opponents didn't have to contend with his arguments or confront the potentially destabilizing fact that some of his principles called their own into question. Hitchens didn't make it easy on the apostate hunters. To many, he was a coarser version of Norman Podhoretz when he talked about Iraq, and a radical humanist truth-teller when he went on Fox News to lambaste the Christian right. If you gave Falwell an enema, he told Sean Hannity the day after Jerry Falwell's death, he could be buried in a matchbox. Then he gave Islam the same treatment, and he was suddenly drooling neocon again. He called for the removal of Saddam Hussein and the arrest of Kissinger at the same time. He endorsed the war on terror, but condemned waterboarding, and signed his name to an American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, lawsuit against the National Security Agency, NSA, for warrantless wiretapping. He defied easy categorization. A socialist who spurned ideology, an internationalist who became a patriot, a man of the left who was reviled by the left. The left isn't a single amorphous entity. It's a vast constellation of often conflicting ideas and principles. Hitchens's style of left-wing radicalism is now out of fashion, but it has a long and venerable history. George Orwell's unwavering opposition to totalitarianism and censorship, Bayard Rustin's advocacy for universal civil rights without appealing to tribalism and identity politics, the post-communist anti-totalitarianism that emerged on the European left in the second half of the 20th century. Hitchens described himself as a First Amendment absolutist, an echo of historic left-wing struggles for free expression, from Eugene V. Debs's assertion of his right to dissent during World War I to the Berkeley free speech movement. Hitchens argued that unfettered free speech and inquiry would always make civil society stronger. When he wrote the introduction to For the Sake of Argument in 1993, he had a specific left-wing tradition in mind, the left of Orwell and Victor Serge and C.L.R. James, which simultaneously opposed Stalinism, fascism, and imperialism in the 20th century, and which stood for individual and collective emancipation, self-determination, and internationalism. Hitchens believed politics is division by definition, but his most fundamental political and moral conviction was universalism. He loathed nationalism and argued that the international system should be built around a common standard for justice and ethics, a standard that should apply to Kissinger just as it should apply to Slobodan Milosevic and Saddam Hussein. He believed in the concept of global citizenship, which is why he firmly supported international institutions like the European Union. He didn't just despise religion because he regarded it as a form of totalitarianism. He also recognized that it's an infinitely replenishable wellspring of tribal hatred. He opposed identity politics because he didn't think our social and civic lives should be reduced to rigid categories based on melanin, X chromosomes, and sexuality. He recognized that the Enlightenment values of individual rights, freedom of expression and conscience, humanism, pluralism, and democracy are universal. They provide the most stable, just, and rational foundation for any civil society, whether they're observed in America, or Europe, or Iraq. And yes, he argued that these values are for export. Hitchens believed in universal human rights. This is why, at a time when his comrades were still manning the barricades against the Imperial West after the Cold War, he argued that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization should intervene to stop a genocidal assault on Bosnia. It's why he argued that American power could be used to defend human rights and promote democracy. As many on the Western left built their politics around incessant condemnations of their own societies as racist, exploitative, oligarchic, and imperialistic, Hitchens recognized the difference between self-criticism and self-flagellation. One of the reasons Orwell accumulated many left-wing enemies was the fact that his criticisms of his own side were grounded in authentic left-wing principles. When he argued that many socialists had no connection to or understanding of the actual working class in Britain, the observation stung because it was true. Orwell's arguments continue to sting today. In his 1945 essay, Notes on Nationalism, Orwell criticized the left-wing intellectuals who enjoy seeing their own country humiliated and follow the principle that any faction backed by Britain must be in the wrong. Among some of these intellectuals, Orwell wrote, one finds that they do not, by any means, express impartial disapproval, but are directed almost entirely against Britain and the United States. Moreover, they do not, as a rule, condemn violence as such, but only violence used in defense of the Western countries. Hitchens observed that many on today's left are motivated by the same principle. Nothing will make us fight against an evil if that fight forces us to go to the same corner as our own government. This is a predictable manifestation of what the American political theorist Michael Walzer calls the default position of the left, a purportedly anti-imperialist and anti-militarist position inclined toward the view that everything that goes wrong in the world is America's fault. As we'll discuss throughout this book, the tendency to ignore and rationalize even the most egregious violence and authoritarianism abroad in favor of an obsessive emphasis on the crimes and blunders of Western governments has become a reflex on the left. much of the left has been captured by a strange mix of sectarian and authoritarian impulses, a myopic emphasis on identitarianism and group rights over the individual, an orientation toward subjectivity and tribalism over objectivity and universalism, and demands for political orthodoxy enforced by repressive tactics like the suppression of speech. These left-wing pathologies are particularly corrosive today because they give right-wing nationalists and populists on both sides of the Atlantic, whose rise over the past several years has been characterized by hostility to democratic norms and institutions, rampant xenophobia, and other forms of illiberalism, an opportunity to claim that those who oppose them are true authoritarians. Hitchens was prescient about the ascendance of right-wing populism in the West, from the emergence of demagogues who exploit cultural grievances and racial resentments, to the bitter parochialism of America First nationalism. And he understood that the left could only defeat these noxious political forces by rediscovering its best traditions, support for free expression, pluralism, and universalism, the values of the Enlightenment. The final 2 decades of Hitchens's career are regarded as a gross aberration by many of his former political allies, a perception he did little to correct as he became increasingly averse to the direction of the left. He no longer cared what his left-wing contemporaries thought of him, or what superficial labels they used to describe his politics. Hitchens closes Why Orwell Matters with the following observation. What he, Orwell, illustrates, by his commitment to language as the partner of truth, is that views do not really count, that it matters not what you think, but how you think, and that politics are relatively unimportant, while principles have a way of enduring, as do the few irreducible individuals who maintain allegiance to them. This is a book about how Hitchens thought, and what today's left can learn from him. 1. First Amendment Absolutism. Hitchens on Free Expression. In his original introduction to Animal Farm, which remained unpublished until 1972, Orwell discussed the pervasive self-censorship in wartime England. The sinister fact about literary censorship in England is that it is largely voluntary. Unpopular ideas can be silenced, and inconvenient facts kept dark, without the need for any official ban. The rest of Orwell's essay was a study of the attitudes and habits that gave rise to this phenomenon: unthinking political loyalty, intellectual cowardice, and the refusal to trespass on certain orthodoxies. If I had to choose a text to justify myself, Orwell wrote, I should choose the line from Milton, by the known rules of ancient liberty. The word ancient emphasizes the fact that intellectual freedom is a deep-rooted tradition without which our characteristic Western culture could only doubtfully exist. Hitchens often noted Orwell's affinity for this line from John Milton because he shared the view that intellectual freedom, as well as its corollary, free expression, was the guarantor of all other freedoms. As he explained, the only thing that should be upheld at all costs and without qualification is the right of free expression, because if that goes, then so do all other claims of right as well. Despite the fact that Orwell often faced overt censorship, his introduction to Animal Farm was more relevant to the threats to free expression in liberal democracies today. Orwell observed that the uncritical admiration of Soviet Russia among British intellectuals was spontaneous and not due to the action of any pressure group. He explained that his essay was about the kind of censorship that the English literary intelligentsia voluntarily impose upon themselves. Orwell is most commonly associated with his attacks on totalitarianism in its purest and most excessive forms, from Stalinism to Big Brother, but he was acutely aware of subtler and more pernicious forms of authoritarianism and censorship. Orwell understood how orthodoxy could corrupt thought, and he didn't just see this phenomenon at work among Soviet sympathizers. In a July 1944 column for Tribune, he discussed the voluntary reticence of the British press in general. One of the most extraordinary things about England is that there is almost no official censorship, and yet nothing that is actually offensive to the governing class gets into print, at least in any place where large numbers of people are likely to read it. Near the end of the essay, Orwell offered his mordant assessment of the state of British journalism. Circus dogs jump when the trainer cracks his whip, but the really well-trained dog is the one that turns his somersault when there is no whip. Self-censorship is a natural byproduct of groupthink. Whether it was British papers refusing to report on issues that were offensive to the governing class, Orwell's example was the business of the abdication, or communists turning somersault after somersault whenever the Soviet party line shifted, Orwell could see that the most powerful censors were often a writer's own fears and loyalties. Every year, the Dennis and Victoria Ross Foundation awards the Hitchens Prize to an author or journalist whose work reflects a commitment to free expression and inquiry. After receiving the prize in 2019, the essayist George Packer explained why the current intellectual atmosphere would be inhospitable to a career like Hitchens's. In his acceptance speech, he asked, "What are the enemies of writing today?" And his first answer was the fact that writers now have every incentive to do their work as easily identifiable, fully paid-up members of a community. Instead of making judgments and arguments independently, they sculpt their views to conform to the demands of their groups. This doesn't just mean committing to the group's dogmas. It also means refusing to say anything that might contradict those dogmas. Packer believes fear is the second enemy of writing. "I don't mean that editors and writers live in terror of being sent to prison," he explained. "The fear is more subtle and, in a way, more crippling. It's the fear of moral judgment, public shaming, social ridicule, and ostracism." Packer echoed Orwell, who thought, "Intellectual cowardice is the worst enemy a writer or journalist has to face in a country like Britain, as suppression and coercion from the state are minimal, a point that's even more true today." Orwell didn't just argue that fear led to self-censorship. He believed it led to bad writing. As he put it in his 1946 essay, The Prevention of Literature, "To write in plain, vigorous language, one has to think fearlessly, and if one thinks fearlessly, one cannot be politically orthodox." One of the reasons Hitchens thought fearlessly and wrote freely was his wariness of political orthodoxy. As he put it, "You mustn't become, or try and become, a party liner, however good the party may be, as a writer. That's a betrayal." Although he was a socialist for most of his career, he jettisoned his formal political commitments by the beginning of the 21st century. The word solidarity was always an essential part of his political lexicon, but the concept evolved in his mind over time, from solidarity with a political movement to solidarity with anyone who embodied or expressed a certain set of ideas and principles. As he explains in Letters to a Young Contrarian, "I don't think that the solidarity of belonging is much of a prize. I appreciate that it can bestow some pride, and that it can lead to mutual aid and even brother and sisterhood, but it has too many suffocating qualities. These qualities include the pressure to think and write in a certain way." In his 1946 essay, Why I Write, Orwell told his readers, "I knew that I had a facility with words and a power of facing unpleasant facts." Hitchens wanted to call his book about Orwell, Why Orwell Matters in the United States and Orwell's Victory in Britain, a power of facing, a suggestion he said was vetoed by his publisher. Hitchens faced many unpleasant facts in his career. After dropping socialism, he claimed to miss his old political allegiances as if they were an amputated limb. After decades as a ferocious critic of U.S. foreign policy, he came to believe that American power was the only effective instrument to secure human rights and defend vulnerable populations from the Slobodan Milosevic's and Saddam Hussein's of the world. However difficult changing his mind on these issues may have been, Hitchens welcomed the barrage of criticism he received for doing so. As his friend, the novelist Martin Amis, observed, "Christopher's always taken up unpopular positions. He likes the battle, the argument, the smell of cordite." In our time, Orwell wrote in his 1946 essay, Politics and the English Language, it is broadly true that political writing is bad writing. Where it is not true, it will generally be found that the writer is some kind of rebel, expressing his private opinions, not a party line. Hitchens made a conscious effort to avoid regurgitating a party line. Instead of turning intellectual somersaults to placate some political party or faction, he wrote and thought for himself. When the Ayatollah Khomeini called for the murder of Salman Rushdie and those associated with the publication and distribution of the Satanic Verses in February 1989, Hitchens was shocked at how quickly many in the West were willing to temper or abandon their professed commitment to free speech. A few weeks after the fatwa was issued, he wrote, "I have seen important figures in the liberal culture employing the excuses of tolerance and pluralism in order to euphemize the intolerant and whitewash the enemies of pluralism." He cited freshly published articles in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Washington Monthly that emphasized the importance of respecting religious sensibilities over free speech. Hitchens noticed that the left was particularly eager to rationalize or even excuse the fatwa as an expression of legitimate religious grievances. "Nothing is more ironic," he wrote, "than to hear certain liberals and leftists identify Islam and the muezzin with the cry of the oppressed and with anti-imperialism." In this case, the self-appointed representative of Islam and voice of the oppressed was the head of a theocratic state who had just waged war against Iraq with human wave assaults and used children as minesweepers. Hitchens denounced the distinguished intellectuals and noisemakers, many of whom quite obviously found Rushdie's book more offensive than the Ayatollah's lethal anathema, or at least no less so. Faced with that astonishing reaction, boring old Voltairean precepts seemed less stale and over-rehearsed. After the Rushdie fatwa, Hitchens discovered that many on the left had the intellectual itch to change the subject away from free speech versus religious absolutism. The response to the Rushdie fatwa was an early reification of what would soon become Hitchens's most pressing concerns about the trajectory of the contemporary left. First, there was the refusal to defend liberal principles in the face of an overt totalitarian challenge. "This is an all-out confrontation between the ironic and the literal mind," he wrote, "between every kind of commissar and inquisitor and bureaucrat, and those who know that whatever the role of social and political forces, ideas and books have to be formulated and written by individuals." Second, there were the abject allowances made for violence and coercion under an insipid and self-abnegating form of multiculturalism. This was partly a consequence of the creeping influence of postmodernism on the left, which we'll examine in the next chapter. In the mind of many socialists, Hitchens observed, cultural relativism has become such an anchor of certainty and principle that it would be physically painful to haul it in. And finally, the fatwa exposed what Hitchens would later describe as a masochistic cultural cringe in liberal democratic societies, especially when it comes to theocratic intimidation and any critique that could be construed as anti-imperialist or anti-racist. In a March 1989 article titled "Rushdie's Book is an Insult," former U.S. President Jimmy Carter complained that Ayatollah Khomeini's offer of paradise to Rushdie's assassin has caused writers and public officials in Western nations to become almost exclusively preoccupied with the author's rights. While Carter offered the perfunctory acknowledgement that First Amendment freedoms are important, he was more concerned about the fact that we have tended to promote him, Rushdie, and his book with little acknowledgement that it is a direct insult to those millions of Muslims whose sacred beliefs have been violated. In other words, Carter believed one of the world's great monotheisms shouldn't be subject to certain forms of artistic reimagining if doing so could cause offense, despite the fact that many of the protesters and rioters who were most incensed by the book couldn't have read it, as it hadn't been translated into their languages. As Hitchens argued, the publication of a novel isn't a violation of anyone's beliefs or rights. The imposition of a death sentence is. The fatwa was a galvanizing event for Hitchens. It synthesized and exposed many of the deepest problems with what he saw as complacent Western liberalism, its susceptibility to theocratic bullying under the cloak of multiculturalism, its unwillingness to take a firm position even when the two sides couldn't be clearer, and most of all, its touch-and-go commitment to free speech. Days after Khomeini issued the fatwa against Rushdie, major bookselling chains, Walden Books, Barnes & Noble, and B. Dalton, which accounted for between 20 and 30% of all U.S. book sales at the time, announced that they would remove the satanic verses from their shelves. The CEO of B. Dalton, Leonard Riggio, admitted that his company was allowing fear to cancel free expression. It is regrettable that a foreign government has been able to hold hostage our most sacred First Amendment principle, he said. Hitchens had nothing but contempt for willing hostages like Riggio. Tomorrow, the shopping malls of the United States, which contain now 1/3 of the book outlets in this country, will, of their own volition, not sell that book because they're scared of a foreign despot. Now, in my opinion, for that to happen in this country, to be scared of a crazy foreign tyrant in this way, is a really serious challenge to what we think of as the safe assumption of free speech and free inquiry, free expression, and the necessity to defend it. And in a way, though I find all this very depressing, I welcome it because maybe we need every generation or so to remind ourselves that it's not a free ride to have free expression, not a free ride to have a free society. The threat of violence was real. When the Satanic Verses was banned in India in October 1988, Rushdie told an Indian journalist, "It would be absurd to think that a book can cause riots." In an open letter to Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in the New York Times, published the same month, he argued, "The right to freedom of expression is at the foundation of any democratic society, and at present, all over the world, Indian democracy is becoming something of a laughingstock. The world wouldn't be laughing just a few months later." On February 24, 1989, around a dozen people were killed and 40 were wounded when police in Mumbai, then Bombay, where Rushdie was born, opened fire on Muslims who were rioting in response to the publication of the Satanic Verses. According to the New York Times, the firefight led to a 3-hour battle, with rioters spilling across the crowded streets of South Bombay, burning cars, buses, motorcycles, and even torching the small police station. The battle took place after at least 3 people were killed and more than 100 were wounded during riots in Kashmir earlier that month. In Islamabad, 6 people were killed and more than 80 were wounded when police fired on protesters gathered outside an American information center to demand that the book be banned. Syed Abdullah Bukhari, the top cleric at the largest mosque in New Delhi, endorsed the call for Rushdie's assassination. The bloodshed would continue for years. In July 1991, the Japanese translator of the Satanic Verses, Hitoshi Igarashi, was stabbed to death in the hallway outside his office at Tsukuba University, northeast of Tokyo. A little over a week earlier, an Italian translator of the book, Ettore Capriolo, was stabbed in his Milan apartment. The attacker demanded to know where Rushdie was hiding. In October 1993, the book's Norwegian publisher, William Nygaard, was shot 3 times outside his home in a suburb of Oslo. He survived. And in August 2022, a man jumped onto a stage where Rushdie was preparing to speak and repeatedly plunged a knife into his face, neck, and abdomen. The would-be assassin was born almost a decade after the Satanic Verses was published. In his memoir, Hitch 22, Hitchens recalls his immediate feeling when...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?